It's a bit of a giveaway when you put pictures and bios out of the speakers, but sadly John had a bereavement in the family and had to not be here today. So I'm currently working with GreySpark on the RTS6 and algo governance program that they've been running for some time, and we're looking at how that fits in with other MiFID programs within a lot of the tier 1, tier 2 banks. And so I stood up and said, right, I'm there. I'll cover, and actually, so I'm familiar with the content area, maybe not so much with the slides. So you will have to be gentle with me, but I'm hoping that you'll appreciate the sentiment that was behind the presentation that John prepared. And I have some of my colleagues from GreySpark in the audience. So if you try and catch me out with any nasty questions, they'll help me out too. So that's the deal. So where are we? Good. That's a good start. So just as a backdrop, really, and it was interesting actually. The gentleman's preceding presentation was interesting from the point of view that, one of the areas that obviously the exchanges are the recipients of a massive amount of flow from different organisations, and of course part of that flow comes from direct members, and those direct members actually open up their infrastructures to other members and other market participants, and many of them run very, very high frequency or very, very high throughput platforms, and many of our tier 1 and tier 2 colleagues are sitting on an infrastructure which has the potential to flood some of those downstream exchange platforms with a lot of information, a lot of orders, and when those are being generated algorithmically, of course, if something goes wrong, then you'll get, might be the exchange that ends up in a sinkhole, but actually the upstream flow might be coming through from something which has gone badly wrong in one of the participants. And so one of the areas of MiFID 2, which is very credible and laudable, is that there are quite strict controls around the access from algos to via either direct exchange, direct electronic access players, or from HFT and tier 1 players themselves into the platforms of the exchanges and the venues. And so RTS6 is one particular part, and we're going to cover that, which talks about the governance around this, which hopefully will bring us, the ultimate goal here is to bring us a bit of good governance, good market practice, and surety around how that flow is dealt with upstream. So that's a little backdrop and maybe a little bit of a join into the previous presentation of what we're talking about here. And I think I start a section on MiFID, which the dreaded M word, which nobody wants to talk about, but of course everybody is talking about at the moment. There's a lot of stuff going on, and hopefully this will give a bit of context around one small part of it. So as a backdrop, electronic trading obviously within cap markets has surged over the past decade. We know that the volumes that are being generated are being generated by also different types of players, and there are more venues, there are faster routes to market, there's more processing power to trade across multiple venues, and there's more common access to some of these very, very high frequency or sophisticated services. And not everybody that accesses via these platforms has necessarily been subject to the same level of governance as those running it in the past. And so this is the point here, is that there's the attempt to bring some commonality and governance to the people that trade algorithmically, maybe through infrastructures that have previously been Formula One in the sense of their performance, but they're being accessed, and that quite scary performance is actually in the hands of people that maybe haven't lived in that world previously. And so that Formula One space, that real sort of colo DEA type access is actually available now and quite accessible to a lot of players in the market. And not all of them have got the good practice and the governance upstream that makes them necessarily accountable for the way they're trading. So prompted by the so-called flash crash and a number of high-profile system failures and cases of market abuse, not surprisingly, the automated nature and the speed and increasing complexity of this whole ecosystem has become a specific area of interest to the regulators with regard to governance and risk controls and testing. Conversely, the same elements are actually in laser sharp focus because of something else which everybody's dealing with as they go through this regulatory minefield, which is the senior management regime. So those that are operating this stuff and need to put governance in place are seeing, their boards being much more accountable for the way that they trade and for any errors and faults that happen. So that's the particular backdrop and the sentiment behind many of the regulatory changes. This is about good practice and safeguarding. But let's home in on this particular requirement, RTS6 and Article 17. So as in the original recital 59 of the level 1 text of MiFID 2, for those that care about that kind of thing, Article 17 talked about the organisational requirements to be met in the and the potential risks arising from algorithmic trading and how those organisational requirements are to be met by all investment firms engaged in algo trading, providing DEA or acting as general clearing members. This is really important. Talks to the point I made about people having access to high performance platforms that maybe didn't have these practices in place before, be that compliance practices, be that operational practices and testing, be that trading practices. So herein lies the indication of this particular regulation. It's not just the end-to-end nature of the requirements, we'll come back to those, and the reach of the governance within an organisation, but more importantly, it's the types of organisations that are caught by this regulation and across many more asset classes than before. So of course we all know that MiFID 1 was predominantly focused on equities, and now MiFID 2 is widened that up to pretty much everything bar cash FX. Many of those players that play in this space won't have systems and controls of this scale in place to meet the demands in January, and obviously it's a work in progress for a lot of people to put all that infrastructure and the governance in place. So these are the smaller hedge funds, the buy-side dealing desks potentially, smaller brokers, others who control their own algorithmic processes, who access the market via their own or DEA providers. So for the first time ever, RTS6 and the legal elements of the delegated acts that were published as part of the review of Article 17 defines the requirements for systematic risk avoidance and governance into a single framework against which firms will report, train and be accountable for annual reviews. So it defines specifically the organisational requirements, the lines of accountability and separation of the procedures around algo trading, the procedures, the development and change management that's involved with rolling out algorithmic trading and accessing via DEA or direct exchange memberships, and the training and access to, and this is critical, to the kill functionality as well. So you previously had potentially a whole bunch of infrastructure, algorithmic trading capability. No single place defined how you needed to run that, who you needed to have access to those frameworks, how they were regulated within internally, and how they were documented, all of which is covered. And furthermore, who has access to actually stepping into the flow and intervening if there is anything that goes wrong. As far as system resilience is concerned, there is a very, very specific section of the regulation now on testing, controlled deployment, stress testing, test environments, resilience and the BCP that's required behind that and the surveillance and the pre-trade controls, which is again something that's going to be quite testing for quite a challenge for some of the smaller mid-tier players that operate algo platforms. They probably don't have real-time surveillance in place right now, and that's going to be a requirement. And also the record keeping. So of course a completely different subject, but there's a whole raft of requirements around record keeping, time stamping, and everything else for this type of flow, and everything else that you do, by the way, within MiFID 2. Similarly, there's a requirement on those that are offering direct electronic access. And so although you may be operating an electronic trading infrastructure that's connected to an exchange, you may not be actually trading with your own algorithms at all. If you're providing electronic access to people that are, you're also caught by exactly the same set of requirements. And there's a very, very specific piece in there in the regulation which talks about the separation and the requirement for as much diligence and governance around those operating the infrastructures for those people that are algo trading and those that are actually putting the algo trades through themselves. So there's oversight and controls within that platform, within that section. There's a separate and distinct monitoring capability, so you need to monitor just as diligently for not just operational elements like performance, but also for market abuse. And there is there's a due diligence and a KYC requirement that's very much prescribed within the regulation about how you onboard people that you're offering electronic access on behalf of, and how you bring them on board. And similarly, I suppose you'd see this as a downstream implication, but within the general clearing members as well, client assessments around credit strength, risk controls and other system controls, and the intended strategies for trading of firms, which obviously, if they're abusive in any way upstream, you know, it's putting a lot of the onus on the member and the general clearing member to actually do some of that filtering and assessment before these people get access to the markets. So that's the backdrop of the four pillars, if you like, of this one piece of MiFID that defines a lot of governance around infrastructures that run algo trading and trading access to the market. So here at Grayspark and a lot of the work the chaps have been doing actually over a while has allowed us to put together, and I thought I'd share it with you, some quite interesting steps really along the process of how do you put in place good governance and procedures around the whole requirement in order to meet end-to-end this part of the regulation. And so obviously and it may look like it's a pretty obvious statement, right? But one of the things first is to actually recognise whether you're caught by this regulation and to notify your local, so be the FCA here in London, that you are. That's part of the procedure, is that you need to establish, am I caught? And that process in itself isn't straightforward because it depends on the type of algos you run, how you access the market, and whether or not those rules are applicable to you. All of the aspects of the behaviour within certain trading strategies then need to be defined. And it's interesting actually, my coming into this project and working with the chaps originally, my assumption, having come from 10 years at a tier one vendor solution provider, was that, well, I guess everybody has these things in place, right? Everybody's documented exactly what their algos do, and how they work, and actually have given that information out to the relevant people internally to enable them to, run operationally what they should be doing, but also to be able to map that onto how they survey what's going on. But I have to say, it's been an interesting process of discovery, but actually it's probably one of the areas that's, because it's quite dynamic, that's least documented. And I guess when you come to a very agile type of development infrastructure, that's not surprising. But actually, I'm guessing, talking to a room at an event that's aimed around, predominantly around testing, you'd like to think that most things are actually tested to a predictable outcome, in which case you've probably defined what the thing did in the first place before you test what it does. But that's not necessarily the case here. The RTS6 scope actually, not surprisingly, I suppose, includes things like quote engines, algorithms, and simple smart order routers as well. So anything that steps in and intervenes with the shape of an order or the timing of an order is deemed to be a trading algorithm, and that's what's caught within the scope of MiFID RTS6 or MiFID Article 17 RTS6. What do you need to do as well? You need to review and document all the risk controls and associated trading limits. Store all the orders and quotes for 5 years to a microsecond accuracy. Now that's the unenviable knock-on of another different article, Article 50, which is another requirement. But nevertheless, it's required within this trading infrastructure, this algorithmic trading infrastructure. What some of the softer elements that I was surprised to read, but actually are very onerous, are actually the requirements to document and train and then manage the change management through this process of training all compliance staff, for example, on algorithm usage. Do they understand really what's going on? Have they actually got the ability to get into the right people to pull orders or to stop algorithms running if they can see some sort of rogue activity, for example? So another seemingly innocuous requirement, which actually has driven some quite serious audits going on now within quite a few of the firms to make sure they can actually do this. Accommodate the kill switch functionality, as I say, that you actually have to have now the ability to from either the trading side or a direct line into the trading side or within compliance, the ability to pull all the orders. Now, typically, we know this from I know this from my trading system days. Obviously, that quite often is done from a service desk or a trading function which sits on the floor. But actually, now compliance users have to have a very, very, very well audited route directly into the right places to actually have access to the kill switch. Real-time order and trade surveillance, which, as I said, is quite a challenge. Most people in most organisations are on the broker side are still doing their surveillance T+1. So this will be a big change. Reviewing the firm's IT business continuity, demonstrate that suitable levels of testing on the standards were performed. Now, I'd like to think that that's best practice that is being done, but again, all this has to be pulled together. And then the review and evidence and documentation of all the trading limits, access to the test methodologies where required, and an annual audit of the whole lot in order to know that this is actually an ongoing process and that the governance is fresh. So that's a little whistle-stop tour of 10 points that need to be done if you're an algo trading firm or you're a direct electronic access provider within this space. And there are no get-out clauses here. This is fairly binary. Once you've recognised who you are, you've got to put it into place. So, not surprisingly, this is a hard nut to crack. So, demonstrating governance and oversight isn't easy. Multiple asset classes with bespoke processes, and so don't forget the scope of this has now become quite broad. It goes beyond equities into other asset classes. And the control framework and the documentation in most places does not sit with one person. And so actually the documentation's fragmented if it's there at all. And so, pulling this stuff together and being accountable for it is not an easy task. Standardization's the key. Now, there is a methodology, and like a lot of things, there are, I'm sure, lots of methodologies within each of our organisations. It's clearly labour intensive. Outsourcing that effort is one option, and we're not here to necessarily talk about that today, but you know, the process of doing this, doing the reviews and everything else should be kick-started quite early, because this stuff takes quite some time to review, in particular the documentation around algos and the way the algos work. So we recently published, this is our nod to the Formula One nature of our high-frequency trading infrastructures. We recently published an article discussing the need for a pit crew that sits around that electronic access platform, who are now firmly embedded in this world. And over the past 5 years, Grayspark have developed controls and best practices for these trading infrastructures, with tools to help capture and evidence the controls in a manner that simplifies the presentation of this to the regulators, etc. So, you know, we are out in the atrium. I'm hoping that you'll all be out there having your lunch very shortly. So if you are interested to talk about what that process looks like and that governance sort of framework looks like, then I'm sure that the chaps that are there will be very happy to have a chat with you about that. So, and that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, and it's with apology that it's about a very, very specific area of MiFID, and I know that we're going to be heading into a few more MiFID topics, but hopefully it's a real-world example of some of the stuff that we probably do some of it today, but how it's really, really defined, how it's got to be pulled together, ready for January 18. So thank you very much. Any questions? Not too hard.